So thank you for coming. In case you want to check in, we're at the Regional State New England Grid Planning Workshop. And my name is Andrea Colmas. I'm with the Energy Action Network, and I'm only going to moderate and facilitate today, which won't take much because we have three amazing panelists to hear from, and then we'll have a rich opportunity for discussion and Q&A and stuff after they present. So broadly, what this workshop is about is clearly reaching our goals is a very complex endeavor. If you include siting and environmental and grid constraints and many, many different kinds of considerations in how we put a renewable and efficiency-based system to work in Vermont and on our landscape. So today we're going to hear from three critical components of our planning work underway to sort out how best to do this. One will be from Jim Sullivan, who's with the Bennington Regional Planning Commission and is also leading on a statewide effort through the regional planning commissions to do in-depth energy planning. And that has started with Bennington, Two Rivers, Ottauquechee, and Northwest Regional Planning Commissions in collaboration with the Department of Public Service. So Jim will share some of the early work emerging from that quarter. Next, I believe we'll hear from Asa, if I have the order right here. Asa Hopkins is the director of, I know you so well, I forgot your title.
Well, it's a made-up title, but Director of Energy Policy and Planning.
I knew it was long. So Asa is the director of all things smart and innovative at the department, and he will share with us work on the 2016 Comprehensive Energy Plan, which I think everyone in the room is aware is nearing completion and will be hopefully the next incredibly constructive milestone, much as the 2011 Energy Plan has been and continues to be for Vermont. And lastly, we'll hear from Tom Dunn, who is with VECAN, in terms of the grid planning work that he's doing from that statewide platform and perspective. So I think with that, I can stop and hand it over to Jim.
Thank you. And I would just like to add thank you to Andy. With her work with the Energy Action Network, I think has been incredibly helpful and supportive to all the work that we've been doing with our project and with similar work around the state. So thank you, Andy. First of all, a little disclaimer. I'm going to be talking about this regional planning initiative. You all came here to hear about grid planning. I know a lot about energy. I really do. I know almost nothing about grid planning, so my apologies for that. So I fortunately have two people here who know a lot more about it than I do. I'm going to give you a background to this regional planning initiative that we've been working on, as Andy mentioned, with three regions around the state. Go through it fairly quickly, and hopefully you'll have some questions when we get through with everything. As Andy mentioned, this is a project funded by the Public Service Department. At the moment, it involves three regional planning commissions, right? Bennington, my home, Two Rivers, and Northwest. There is a commitment by the department to provide support for the rest of the regional planning commissions around the state after we finish this pilot project. So I think that's absolutely critical that we bring this work around the state. I'm going to jump around a little bit. This project consists of a number of elements. One of the really important things is to help us develop regional energy plans that will inform local decision making and local energy plans. And the concept really is to keep our eye on the state's energy goals. Bear in mind that 90% renewables by 2050, and all that means how do we work at the local and regional level to make that happen? And I think that one of the really, really critical things about that is putting some real numbers to it. Us planners, we're great at talking in real wonderful generalities and really aspirational language. But what does it really mean? What does 90% by 2050 really mean? And there's our target. How do we get there? So working with the department also provided some funding for us to work with both EAN and VEIC, Vermont Energy Investment Corporation, to do some modeling work and figure out what it actually looks like, this 90% by 2050, statewide and within our regions. And those of you who have read the 400-page Comprehensive Energy Plan and the Total Energy Study and all the other good work that ACE has done, actually probably would notice some similarities here. But just kind of a broad brush overview of some of the big things that we see happening between now and 2050 is to get to that goal. The really critical elements is, big part is here, the not so colorful part of the graph, but probably one of the most important parts is the overall reduction in the total amount of energy that we need to use by 2050. We really need to reduce our energy usage by about a third for any practical, reasonable possibility for success at the 90 by 2050. So there's a lot of efficiency and conservation measures up here that we have to pay as much attention to, if not more, than to all this stuff down here. Other really critical things to look at here is, this is electricity. You see that the amount of electricity that we're using over time actually goes up quite considerably. I think maybe by about 70%. Maybe that's why I'm here talking with the electricity expert. But for us to provide the amount of energy that we need across all sectors, there has to be a significant transition to use of electricity. Electricity, which is a carrier of energy that's generated from renewable sources. Other really critical things, and I'll show a little bit more detail on some of these things later, is the space heating fuels, the oil and the propane and the natural gas. Those things really start to squeeze down to a very small percentage in the future of what they are right now. The renewable fuels like biomass, woody biomass especially, goes up, and there's a very hopeful expansion of liquid biofuels as well. This is maybe the most interesting part of the colorful part of the graph anyway. This is kind of this little narrow band in here. That's the 10% of the renewable fuels, the non-renewable fuels that are left by 2050. And those are the things that we rely pretty heavily on today, and they really get squeezed down for both transportation, for heating, for just about everything. This is kind of breaking it down regionally, looking at different sectors. In the residential sector in Bennington region, you see again a significant reduction in the total amount of energy used, because the projected growth for the Bennington region is not nearly as high as it is for other parts of the state. We wind up actually having a more significant drop-off in our total energy use than a lot of other parts of the state. About 70% of this residential energy demand is energy used for space heating, and most of our heating now in the region is, big chunk here is fuel oil, and you can see how much of that is left there, which informs some of the strategies that we're going to have to look at going forward. Significant emphasis. Sorry, we're a little fuzzy. I don't know how we.
There, it's better.
Okay. Yes, there's a significantly increased emphasis on heat pump technology and a use of wood fuels too. The amount of cordwood actually goes down a little bit. Maybe with cordwood and pellets it's about the same, but as a percentage of the final mix it's significantly increased. And again, that's because of the large white space that appears in all of our graphs. That's what we really need to focus on up front is the conservation efforts to reduce the amount of fuel that we use. I threw the transportation one up there too, because that's the one that most people really have the hardest time getting their heads around. It really requires a total transformation of our of the way we do and think about transportation, and this really requires an integrated approach of both land use planning and transportation planning. We really need to change the way people live and a lot of where they live and do business to reduce the requirement for the amount of driving that they do. And again, you can see that, right? Gas and diesel. Where does it go? It's up there. Peter Welch talked about ethanol. Well, ethanol is there, and that counts for the good, but question of whether that really should count for the good. So I think we're really, looking very heavily at some significant land use changes, a greater reliance on public transportation and bicycle and pedestrian and electrification of the vehicle fleet. So how do we get there? Big part of this project is, again, I said, trying to figure out how to move things forward at a regional level and at a local level, developing specific strategies. And we're talking about thermal, transportation, and electricity strategies, and try to make them as specific as possible for our regions. What specific actions can we take? There's a tremendous amount of information out there about existing technologies, existing programs. EAN does a huge amount of really great work getting the word out on those things. What our job is, I think, is to find some real practical ways to move things forward on all of those fronts. This is real, I'm going to go through the electricity stuff because that's why we're out here, right? So this is again from the LEAP modeling that the EIC did with us. It's again similar to what was done statewide. What does the electricity mix look like going forward between now and 2050? So this is kind of what our thinking is based on around a lot of the renewable energy stuff. We're over here now. We've seen this nuclear drop off with the elimination of the Vermont Yankee contract and the closing of that facility. We're projecting, that increase in natural gas usage from regional generators having to decline over time. We have a lot of hydro right now. It's a big part of our mix that counts as renewable energy. Most of that is from Hydro-Quebec. There's a fair bit of in-state generation. Going forward, running it out to 2050, we're looking at a little bit of biomass up here left over, maybe combined heat and power, and a little bit of nuclear remaining. All this is renewable, right? And we're talking about of this hydro, I think it's close to 95% of that is imported, and that's an assumption. Okay, there's lots of assumptions. This whole thing is built on assumptions, but there's only so much additional hydro capacity left in the state. But hydro is, it's there. It's reliable. Is it going to be available to us in that quantity and at a reasonable cost in 2050? That's what the model is assuming right now. But again, a big chunk of that is imported. All of this new electricity generation from solar and wind is anticipated to be in-state. Okay, all it shows in this model basically, and that's a pretty big increase from where we are now. So that's a lot of the rest of our work. And this is just a table that kind of breaks down, again, based on assumptions for what is needed with electricity demand to meet electricity demand in 2050 statewide, broken down by in-state wind, hydro, and solar. Again, this hydro number is kind of fixed based on assessments of actual potential at existing dams. Might need to be a little optimistic. And then it's broken down regionally for the 3 regions that we're working at now, but on the basis of projected future demand. So how much demand is going to be coming from each of our regions, and then it's broken down wind, hydro, solar. There's other ways of looking at that. So we're doing some renewable energy mapping that's gotten a fair bit of attention lately for solar, wind, hydro, and biomass in each of our regions. We're first looking at where the resource is, so where's the sunshine, where does wind blow, where does water flow, and then we're looking at constraints on top of that. We call some of them level 1 constraints, some of them level 2 constraints. Met with a lot of folks from around the state, identified some resources that pretty much everybody agreed are not areas that can be developed, floodways and river corridors, wilderness areas, rare and irreplaceable natural areas, high quality wetlands, like that. Then we look at level 2 constraints, these features here. Those are places where there's significant environmental resources there that we all recognize are there. They don't necessarily preclude renewable energy development, but we need to be mindful of their presence. Uh-oh. I hope I didn't. Okay, I'm going to skip. One of the things that the regional planning commissions we think bring to this is the next layer of analysis, which doesn't really show up here. This is just a map that illustrates what I showed you. But one of the things that we can do is go out to local communities, talk in our regions, figure out what other resources that are not these statewide resources need to be considered. What are some of the real critical local areas, historic areas, designated scenic areas, areas that we should avoid, as well as what are some areas where there's real opportunities for renewable energy development. So we should put some stars on the map too. Say, take a look at this as a priority area. So that's some of the real important outreach we're doing in communities. And for all of you, it's a great opportunity for you to come out and weigh in on those things. This is a zoomed in map this is the town of Bennington that shows the solar analysis, kind of a baseline solar analysis. The yellow areas, the bright yellow areas, those are areas where there's good solar resource and there's no identified level 1 or level 2 constraint. And the other colored areas are also areas where there's a good solar resource, but there's some level 2 constraint. The white areas, which is a majority, but not a huge majority, are areas where there's either not good access to solar energy and or there are those level 1 constraints. We just whited all those out. And that's been done for all of the types of all those 4 levels of renewable resources. So just to get a picture of what the numbers look like, this is the amount of area in the Bennington region, 370,000 plus acres represented by this circle. Proportionately, this is the amount of unconstrained land with good solar energy potential. And that little guy right there is the dot that represents the amount of that land area within this circle that would need to be developed.
How many acres is that?
I think it's about 700 acres. That's a fairly conservative estimate about the land area that would be needed to meet that 77 megawatt target that we had for our region. Everybody always asks about rooftop solar. So can you do all that on rooftops? Because we'd much rather have it on rooftops than out in pastures and fields. So we did a real quick analysis of that, and so we looked at all the residential structures, all the small commercial structures, all the large commercial structures in our region, just gross number-wise. Made some assumptions about if we were really aggressive and very successful, that we might cover like 25% of all of those with about as much PV potential as we could get. And we get about 34 megawatts, so somewhat less than half of the potential could happen rooftop. That doesn't look at parking lots and things like that. Then allocating this around the region, towns are very interested. What does this mean for my town? So we looked at, rather than a demand-based thing, we first looked at where's the resource, where's the solar resource. This is a bar chart. This is Bennington, which is about half the population in our region. Manchester is the next largest town, also has a lot of demand. Some of the real small towns, like Landgrove, little town, also shows as having a lot of potential. They have a big, beautiful, broad, open valley right in the middle of Landgrove that shows up pretty well for potential, but that's also a designated scenic area in Landgrove. So in our analysis, take that out, so that bar will go down quite a bit. But maybe just as helpful, we're looking at, where's the practical feasibility for some of this stuff too, because some of these areas are pretty remote. So looking at, relative proximity to the grid, and 3-phase power, and then, places like Landgrove go down quite a bit anyways. More developed areas like Bennington and Manchester, where it has most of the population base and most of the demand, fortunately go up quite a bit. Then we look at other regions, and that's a discussion that's kind of just getting started now, is how do we actually balance this stuff around the state? And this is just the prime solar resource around the state. There's different ways to balance this out. Obviously, if we did it just based on demand, future demand, Chittenden is going to be up here, but at the same time, they don't have as much land area as some of the other places, so a significant discussion to be had. This is just a quick picture at the end of a long process of doing a similar type of analysis for wind energy resources, where we looked at where the areas are that have most access to wind. We have, really good north-south running high elevation ridgelines in our region, and most of the population is concentrated in the valley area. All these dots that are all blocked together, those are where there's existing residential structures. So these lightly shaded areas and these darker shaded bluish areas in here are areas where there's good or very good potential for wind energy development. We buffered out the residential properties by 1 kilometer and a mile to see what it would look like what's left over, what's fairly far away from residentially developed areas. And we're left with these areas. The darkest spots are the places that have the highest wind energy potential. And there's a little Big Spruce Mountain in West Arlington, and Egg Mountain in northwest Sandgate and Rupert, and to an extent, some of the ridge lines in Dorset. Any of you know Dorset well?
Yeah.
Okay. That would be an interesting discussion.
It would.
So, anyway, that is the end of my show, and I probably talked too long. So.
No, I think that's great. Thanks.
So I'm similarly going to talk big picture, total energy, but I sort of stripped out a little bit of stuff to focus a little bit more on the electric piece, but at the same time, it does fit into a whole comprehensive energy picture, and particularly at the moment when we are finalizing the comprehensive energy plan, that's where our thinking is at the moment. So bear with us on that. I do want to emphasize in the comprehensive energy plan that it is a comprehensive multi-agency effort. So while I'm here talking about it from the Public Service Department, there's no way we could have completed the plan as we have without help from natural resources, transportation, agriculture, commerce and community development, human services, both the health department and the weatherization folks, and the Department of Building and General Services coordinates all of the state agency planning about how the state can itself lead by example as an energy consumer. But also, I want to, I'm just going to spend the next 6 months going around the state saying thank you. I've got about 800 comments over or people speaking at public hearings and such over the course of the comprehensive energy planning process. The level and depth and quality of the comments we got is stunning and amazing, and it's just really, really, really helpful. So any of you who sent in comments or were involved in organizations that were crafting comments, just a big thank you from us. The level of concreteness, just directional comments, but also the folks who are like, this word on page 292 really pisses me off, right? Like, that's actually really helpful, because like we can write it and we can think it's totally reasonable, but if you read it and you hear something different than what we intended, then it's really helpful because someone else is going to read that too. So if we can fix that, we really appreciate that. So we've got a lot of different input throughout the process. So one of the things that we really worked off of in developing the plan is to recognize that energy policy and why we do energy, we don't do energy for energy's sake. We don't just sort of turn on the lights because we love the fact that the meter spins when we do that. We turn on the lights because we want the light, right? We get in our cars. I guess some people, some amount of driving really is just pleasure driving, but even that's not. You're not doing that in order to burn the gasoline and use the energy. You're doing that in order to experience that pleasure. And mostly what we're doing is trying to get somewhere, move goods and services from place to place, move ourselves to work. So what we're after in designing energy policy is really about the economy, about a vibrant and equitable economy. It's about the environment, about healthy ecosystems and a sustainable environment, and it's about our human health, healthy Vermonters. So the plan really distilled all that. This is one of the places where this interagency collaboration was particularly important, was to really distill down into essentially a page of principles. What are we after with all of this? and then recognize that as we go through and weigh different options for where to put emphasis or different recommendations, how those things are advance these goals and try not to get in each other's way. These goals can be in conflict. There can be stuff that's great for the economy and bad for the environment and vice versa. And so we're trying to find the path through that advances all of these goals without taking steps backwards. And where we find the places where that's consistent, that's where the plan gives priority. So this is my first chance to try to talk through this version of the presentation about energy and how it comes into our economy and flows. But this picture has been very helpful to us, and you'll see versions of this in the final version of the plan. So this is energy flows in Vermont as of today. This is a different version of the same bar chart, and the actual numbers are pretty similar to the numbers that were in the regional modeling. But basically, energy inputs here in the first column, this is all the hydro, wind, and solar that powers Vermont now, mostly hydro. Now, this is nuclear electricity, this is nuclear energy. This is all different kinds of bio, whether it's wood or liquid biofuels predominantly. And this is all the fossil fuels that we use. So big picture, then you can look down at this and see that we're something in the sort of 16% renewable range now, the bio plus the hydro, wind, and solar piece. With following that downstream, going into our electricity, if we get a bunch of our electricity from hydro, wind, and solar, and from nuclear, and a goodly chunk from fossil fuels, and then that comes out as electricity, I'll point out that this sort of light pink piece coming out there and heading over there towards wastes and losses, which is more than half of the energy that goes into the electric sector, doesn't come out as useful electricity. It comes out as waste of some sort. It comes out as predominantly as heat going up smokestacks in power plants from all of the fossil fuel plants not capturing that heat and using it. So there's a goodly contribution to our overall energy waste is in that conversion process. Hydro, wind, and solar, for example, don't have that. So part of the way that we reduce the total energy that we use in the state over time is by shifting from combustion fossil fuels to these non-combustion sources. So I follow the flow downstream. You see transportation is basically all about fossil fuels. A little bit of bio in it. That's the ethanol that we already have blended in gasoline. The industrial sector is about fossil fuels, some amount of bio, particularly in the wood products industry, and then electricity. And buildings are about fossil fuels, basically for heat, bio basically for heat, and a little bit of electricity. And then tracing the waste out of that, see transportation, burning gasoline to drive your car, something like 20% of the energy that's actually chemical energy in the fuel actually turns into motion of your vehicle. Your engine gets hot. Well, the fact that your engine is hot didn't help you get anywhere, right? So there's just a lot of waste there in that conversion process. The industrial sector is pretty efficient, but buildings about half gets lost. So just keep this one in mind, and I'll show some sense of the future. So looking at that then and trying to think about what goals we can set to move beyond just the goals from the last plan of 90% renewable by 2050, maintaining that goal, but recognizing that what else we can say about how we get there. The first is that we reduce the total energy consumption per capita 15% over the next 10 years, and by a third or more by 2050. This is the white space at the top of Jim's bar graphs that you saw as well. And you'll see that in a moment when we go through the rest of those flow diagrams. And then of the remaining energy need, 25% of it from renewable sources by 2025, 40% by 2035, and 90 by 50. So bringing it a little bit closer to the present, not just 35 years from now, but 10 years from now, and making it that much more concrete about energy use reduction, renewable energy growth in that immediate next 10-year time frame. It happens, and I think this is more coincidence than prescience on the part of the legislature, but several years ago, the legislature established a statutory goal of 25 by 25. So we intend to take them up on that. So this is the same diagram to just walk through. So I'm just going to show you a little bit about how this changes in 2025, 2035, 2050. This is just scale. This is the same scale. So you see, we'll sort of animate this back and forth a little bit. It's all on one page, so you can sort of scan up and down the page in the printed version of the plan. But so say watch the fossil piece there, 15, 25, 35, 50. Right? That's what this means to go to that large fraction of renewables. Take a look at the total amount of energy we're using. That's just the height of the chart shrinking. Watch the waste and losses shrink, shrink, shrink. Right? Watch, at the same time, watch productive energy. The energy that's actually, this is quality of life, this is heat, this is manufacturing output, this is what we're doing with energy, grows and grows and grows. Right? So it's not about restrictions in our quality of life. It's not about austerity. It's not energy austerity. It's squeezing the waste out of the system. So thinking about the electric piece, and I'll try to focus towards that, given the focus on this panel. The electric piece, look at that, the electric blue bar there, grows, but in particular, by 2050, the waste piece coming out of that is just this little bit thinner than my finger here, right? And we're actually using a very large fraction of the energy that comes in because we're using these non-combustion-based fuel sources. This is the same sort of growing color chart that Jim showed, showing wind, solar, hydro generating the vast majority of our electricity. Then there's so much more useful electricity compared to the amount of energy in when you're not wasting it and sending it up a smoke bed. Transportation electrifies to the point that it's only half waste because we're still burning fuels for heavy duty in this illustrative example. Buildings actually end up having no net waste at all at this point because when you're using heat pumps to move heat rather than to generate it, you end up actually having more energy in the building that's useful than it took to put in the building in the first place, because all you've done is move the energy rather than create it. So you end up actually squeezing the net waste out of the building sector entirely. So just putting this in a different form, 3 different kinds of efficiency that help us squeeze that waste over the next 35 years. Obviously, continued improvements in thermal and electric energy efficiency, building shells, better appliances, better light bulbs, all the things that we drive at all the time. Fuel switching away from combustion and towards electricity. And then fuel switching the electricity away from combusting to make the electricity and towards non-combustion sources. So by having a non-combustion electric source in the first place, going into something like a heat pump or an electric vehicle, using that electricity directly so much more efficiently, and getting that energy service, the primary energy to actually service delivered ratio just grows by so much in order to make this actually work. So just a snapshot of goals, and then I'll switch to electricity. In the building sector, it's about 20% renewable now, so we think we can get 50% more than that, or 30% renewable by 2025. And then in terms of new building construction, that's mostly about choices made in existing buildings, because we're not going to build so many new buildings over the next 10 or 15 years. But we do want all new buildings to be net zero by 2030. And then in the transportation sector, transportation is a little behind in the sense that there haven't been a lot of renewable options. We don't have wood-powered cars. And we do have some amount of ethanol and gasoline, but as Welch mentioned and such, that's not necessarily the greatest biofuel. It might be able to get better over time, but we don't really want to just say, well, let's just ramp that. That doesn't get us to our combustion reduction. That doesn't get us to making our energy supply more local, any of those other aspects. So we want to try to get from our current 6% or so to 10% by 2025, doing that part by restraining demand so that you can have a more manageable target to reach, means keeping vehicle miles traveled per capita flat at or below 2011 levels. And you would get to this level if about 10% of all the light-duty vehicles plugged in by 2025, and if biodiesel for heavy-duty, the diesel, we're able to get up to 10% or so bio. in that time frame. On the electric side, we can get to about 2/3 renewable by 2025. That is the target that's established by the renewable energy standards the legislature passed in the last session. We're recognizing from those last two pieces that one of the main ways you get these numbers to change is by electrifying things. Then when you look at what you need in terms of the overall electric demand, you get a dramatic increase driven by the red piece is heat, the purple piece is transportation. The sort of generic other electric energy uses, whether it's in industrial actually growing or elsewhere in buildings shrinking a little bit, those are relatively constant, but the transformation of heat and transport into electricity really drives that increase. So how do you actually do that on the grid? First is to recognize that we have this paradigm shift happening now in terms of how the grid functions. It has been for a long time. The utilities would do their planning. They'd say, all right, load looks about like this. Your generic weekday looks like that. Your generic summer and winter day, here's what the load shapes are. Let's do monthly on and off peak load forecasts. Take account of economic growth, and that's our load forecast, and then we'll go out and acquire generation to meet that. End of story, right? That doesn't necessarily work in a world where you're transitioning first to a place where a larger fraction of your supply isn't something you can turn on and off. You'd really like to capture all the wind and the sun when it's windy and sunny, and not throw some of that away. Even a goodly fraction of our hydro is driven by when the water is flowing in the streams, given the water quality regulations. At the same time, more demand is actually becoming controllable, and storage technology is advancing. So demand and storage together at the demand side, really being able to have demand go up at the times when it's windy and sunny, and demand go down when it's not. So this sort of sense that you have a load forecast and you match it. Now we have there's some amount of lack of control and some amount of control on both sides of that equation. How do you get that to match overall? One thing that we can do to address that is to recognize the value of distributed energy resources across this whole spectrum from supply, demand, and storage. That controllable demand is a distributed resource. It's just spread out across all the buildings all around the state. If we think about the number of EVs that you'd be needing to hit the transportation targets, then you've got a bunch of load that you can charge or not charge or potentially even discharge onto the grid at different times to help manage that. That's movable storage. How are you actually going to get that to work? Where does it plug into the grid? Where is it at any given time? Could be on the road, could be at home, could be at work. We transition to use the sense now, everybody will charge their EVs overnight. Well, in 30 years, everybody may need to charge their EVs at work because they need to charge their EVs when the sun is shining. So that we're going to have to work different paradigms about how that's going to work over time. And we can lower both electric bills or total energy bills and electric rates through energy efficiency and through optimal use of the electric infrastructure. About half of the cost we pay for electricity is paying for infrastructure costs, not for marginal energy supply. So if you're putting more units of energy across the same grid, then we're in a place where that cost of that infrastructure can be split across more units, and the actual per kilowatt hour rate that we pay can go down. So there's an economic look there for the folks, particularly in the manufacturing sector, who like to speak up about what the per unit rates are. Managing demand, obviously efficiency remains our lowest cost resource. We need to manage the load from these new electric uses. If all this heat and transport results in us needing to reconductor lines and build new substations and put new transformers in, then you're not getting those lower costs. So we need to figure out how to manage those loads to keep them from getting out of control. And we need to use the smart grid and the related IT infrastructure that we have to do that grid management. The final plan does not have exactly that recognition on smart rates, but does have a continued push towards having rate design really use our smart meter infrastructure and engage customers themselves directly in changing behavior to help the grid function well. The last slide is, in some sense, the equivalent of one of the slides that Jim showed, so I'll go through quickly, but just says the plan looks at the implications of 3 different scenarios, the land use implications of 3 different scenarios for different electric mixes, recognizing that methane, woody biomass, and small hydro are not resources that are likely to grow a whole lot, if at all. And so the rest is basically large hydro, solar, and wind. And you make different mixes, either a lot of solar and a lot of wind, or a lot of solar and less wind, or less solar and more wind, and what that does in terms of the overall portfolio. There's a greater discussion of that in the plan. And with that, I will wrap and let Tom take us a little deeper into the grid.
Well, good morning. Great to be here to talk about the electric transmission system. Today, hopefully, in the next 10 minutes or so, you'll know a little bit more about what VECAN does and what the importance of the grid, both to reliability as well as to the transformation that's ongoing in Vermont in terms of the energy world. So, and I think one of the things I'd like to leave you with is our importance that we at VECAN attach to being a collaborative partner in this conversation and in this transformation. I've been in the energy business in Vermont for 20 years, and I would say the level of collaboration that I see across all the parties who are interested in energy is higher than it's ever been. And I take great heart in that because it's so important that we are doing it this way. I think Congressman Welch, said it well. We're figuring a way to kind of craft our future in the energy world. So we want to be a partner in that and share information and help realize a different energy future. So what is VECAN? Well, we're a Vermont Electric Power Company, Rutland, Vermont, 150 employees. We run the electric transmission system. You can think of it as the interstate highway system for electricity. We're basically a transportation company. We move electricity from different places. We have interconnections with New York, Massachusetts, Hydro-Quebec. And our job is to make sure that this system functions properly 365 days a year. This system is a small piece of a much larger interconnected grid. This grid extends from the Rocky Mountains to the East Coast, from Florida all the way to Saskatchewan. It operates in a way that there has to be instantaneous balancing of the amount of electricity demand and the amount of electricity being produced. And the essence of what we do is to make sure that this grid is reliable. And to the extent that we do our job, most people don't even know who VECAN is. And that's okay, to some extent. But there have been instances, 2003, there was a national-sized kind of blackout, affected over 60 million people. And that was a case where a transmission system operator didn't do some of the things they should do. And the consequences didn't stop in Cleveland, Ohio. They actually they affected the state of New York in a big way and stopped at the border of Vermont. I quite frankly tell you that we were sort of fortunate that we weren't pulled into that as well. But it's really important. People die if this grid isn't reliable. There's enormous economic cost if the grid isn't reliable. And we have a big role, I would say, in crafting this energy future. So a little few more words about that. VECAN. We've been around. We'll be celebrating our 60th anniversary next year. For a long time, we were focused on operations. The last 10 years or so, we've been doing a lot of construction. After the 2003 blackout, the reliability standards that we have to operate became mandatory, and we had a lot of transmission construction that resulted from the application of these new reliability standards. And again, back to, if you don't do a good job, down in Florida about 5 or 6 years ago, the utility down there was doing some work. It was done improperly. There was an outage, and the outage was felt all the way to Saskatchewan. And the utility was fined over $20 million because of the way they had gone about this work and the way they had planned their system. So the construction, the operations is a big part of what we do today and will be a big part of what we do going into the future. But as I look at where Velco is going, information that we have that exists throughout Vermont is going to be the key to our future, and it's going to be the key to the future of transforming this energy world in Vermont. Data, I think Asa touched on some terrific things, and I'll get into that a little bit more, but the importance of data, getting more out of the existing infrastructure, operating the system that instead of having 300 generators on it, has thousands of generators. That's a profound change, and there's no doubt we can do it, but it's going to take the work of the entire state, and Vermont, quite frankly, is a leader in figuring out how this new system works and how it operates. Transmission planning. This is the space where each transmission operator, including Velco, looks at how is our system operating today, how is it operating next week, and how is it operating 5 years from now. We create transmission plans. In New England, there's an entity called ISO New England, the Independent System Operator of New England. They control planning for New England. We work with them on this planning effort. That's a big part of it. A key input to the planning process is the load forecast. And that is something that has changed fundamentally here in Vermont in the last few years. Historically, 1.5% a year increase in load. I could be a load forecaster with a ruler. That's no longer the case. What we're projecting, and we do a forecast, I think we do one every year, at least every other year. We're projecting flat energy demand and flat peak forecasts. As a result of that, and load growth historically has driven the need to add to infrastructure. As a result of that load forecast, we've been back to our friends at ISO New England who have told us, well, the Vermont grids need certain upgrades. We have the Vermont System Planning Committee. There's a link there. I would encourage all of you to, if you're interested in learning more about transmission, that's a great place to learn more about it. But, we had a deficiency on our system, and there was a transmission upgrades that were going to fix that deficiency. The Vermont System Planning Work, which is a collaborative body. It involves utilities, it involves folks from various, I think, energy, some of the folks from energy committees are on that. We looked at what was going on in Vermont, and we came to this determination that rather than building transmission lines, we didn't have to do it. And it was an unusual conversation down at ISO New England to say, no, we don't need to build 60 miles of transmission line. And I will tell you, from a financial perspective, companies like Velco make money building transmission lines. So it was a bit unusual. I think we were probably the only utility transmission owner in New England to go back to ISO New England and say, we don't want to do that. And why do we do it? I think one of our core values is it's the right thing to do. And it's a reflection of the energy landscape is absolutely changing. And I think and we want to see other transmission owners in New England look at their system the same way that we here in Vermont are doing. Because I think the deployment of distributed resources that's affecting how much energy we're using here in Vermont is happening in other places. And it will have a similar impact in terms of transmission construction. I mentioned how Vermont has changed. This is just this graph, or this table shows the sources of electricity. And this is looking at it simply from a physical perspective. Where does our electricity come from? Well, up until last year, Vermont Yankee provided more than half of the amount of electricity that was produced in the state of Vermont. Without Vermont Yankee, we're now in a place where much of our electricity is coming from outside of Vermont. And this is a physical, this is the physical flow of electricity. And it simply reflects the fact that the largest generator in Vermont went away last year. And captured the fact that 84% of the time, we're importing a fair amount of power. Where is that coming from? It could be any of our interconnections with New York, Quebec, New Hampshire, or Massachusetts. the importance of the transmission system, the transmission system's role in making sure the lights stay on, the reliability is there, is only growing over time. I mentioned what we're seeing, and I'm sure most of you are very familiar with the amount of solar that's been deployed in Vermont, as well as large wind projects. It's remarkable, and it is having a profound effect. You can think of VELCO as sort of keeping the state meter for electricity. We don't see the gross load. What we see is the load, the net load that's not met by rooftop solar and all the other things that are out there. It is remarkable to see that, that what has changed in the last 3 to 4 years even. But one of the things that we talked a lot about, and I'll spend a little bit more time on this in a minute, but where these resources show up matters. Not all the places on the grid are configured in a way that they can absorb all of the renewable resources that are showing up, or any resources. But for the most part, we're talking about renewable resources. So here's our champ curve. This is a graph that shows the daily load shape. The hours are on the bottom, the amount of demand that we're using. And what it shows is Vermont is having a much bigger impact than the rest of New England during the middle of the day. And this is a sunny day. You can see that our demand is dropping quite a bit more so than what's going on in New England. And it simply reflects how fast Vermont has adopted solar. And I think that New England is not seeing the same kind of impact. It's about half of where we are right now. I think that's just a matter of time. Massachusetts and some other states have very strong programs in developing and deploying solar. I think we'll see more of that. But the point that Asa made in terms of changing the thinking about, historically people talked about electric vehicles and the conventional thinking was you charge electric vehicles at night. Oftentimes that's when electricity prices are really low. But when you look at this shape, and I think that level is only going to go down over time, it may make a lot more sense to charge electric vehicles during the day. And that's just one example, but there's lots of different things. And another little interesting thing here is historically, this peak here, what was that? That were water heaters turning back on at 7 o'clock at night. And historically, that was a good time to turn them on because on our peak, normally our peak was this time of the day, so you wanted that load to be off the system. And now, our peak is occurring at 7 and 8 o'clock at night. So really, again, thinking about where do you want those water heaters turning on? Probably in the middle of the day. And you don't want them coming on at 7 o'clock at night, because for grid operators, I mentioned the real-time demand. The challenge, and you may have heard about the California duck curve and things like that. 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock at night, what happens to the grid? Solar goes away, the demand effectively starts coming back. And in California, the slope of this line is really steep. And some people would say, well, that's a problem with solar. And I think really it's really more a matter of figuring out new and innovative ways to manage that number. I thought Asa, I really liked what you had to say in terms of, first off, look at energy efficiency. Try to reduce the amount of electricity you need to have. Look at how you can manage the demand for electricity. And because what happens in the grid basis at this time of the day, right now, what ISO New England probably is doing is running gas turbines to be ready on standby. And as that load comes back, they put those turbines online. That's sort of the old thinking. I think the new paradigm is you might have some of those gas turbines running, but more likely what you'll see is sophisticated demand response programs. You may see storage and other stuff. And that's absolutely where the energy thing is, the future is. So I mentioned northern Vermont, and I every time I talk about distributed resources, I want to make sure I touch on northern Vermont. Northern Vermont is a place that has a relatively small amount of electric demand. The transmission system that was built over the years to serve that electric demand is rather small, has limited capability. What has happened over the last 7 or so years is that there have been a lot of projects, primarily renewable projects, And now, rather than an area where the electricity is flowing into northern Vermont, electricity is now trying to get out of northern Vermont. And from a transmission grid perspective, there's a limitation of how much electricity can get out of northern Vermont. And ISO New England runs the show. They create what we call, what are called operating guides. And they tell us how much generation can run in northern Vermont. And what has happened occasionally is that the amount of generation in northern Vermont is limited. And it's called curtailments. It's an issue. It's something to be solved. The concern that I have is that putting more resources in northern Vermont, you could result in a situation where one renewable is curtailing another renewable. And that is not a result that makes any sense from a policy perspective or an economic perspective. We're looking at northern Vermont. There are solutions. There's solutions about getting data and figuring out how to maximize the amount of capacity on using the existing infrastructure. There's a possibility of looking at storage in northern Vermont. And then, of course, a more traditional approach would be building more transmission lines. And I will tell you that's the last thing that we want to do. We'd much rather look at what we already have and maybe some new technology to get more out of the existing system. One project that we have going on that I think reflects the innovation that is going on in the state of Vermont is something we call the Vermont Weather Analytics Center. This is a 2-year research project that we're doing with IBM. And it starts with developing a super accurate weather forecast going out 72 hours. And when I say super accurate, I'm talking about something, the European models and other things, if you know weather, the level of accuracy is about 12 to 16 square kilometer level of accuracy. We're working on a program that's down to 1 square kilometer. And the idea of this is super accurate information, not just on rainfall, snowfall, but also cloud cover. Using that information, feeding it into a model that will predict how much electricity we're going to use as a state. Second item is to look at how much we're going to get from renewable energy resources, wind and solar. Using that information to go into a probabilistic model to determine if you can predict how much demand you have, if you can predict how much renewable generation you have, you can then look at how the grid operations will change. This is a capability that is being developed across the country. We thought it was the right thing to do 2 years ago. I would say the development since that time have only confirmed how important this is. And if we're going to have more and more renewable electricity, the ability to see it, the ability to predict how much you're going to get from it, makes this stuff look a lot more like traditional resources. So rather than just having, well, we're not sure how much solar or wind we're going to get in the course of the day, we'll have a forecast for it. And therefore, the grid operators, once they have confidence in that information, they can reduce the number of gas turbines they're running. And so that'll be cleaner, that's going to save a lot of money. And so this is a project we're really excited about, and I'd be happy to share more about it later. Thank you.
Are there alternatives to combustion? Because that's what they're doing.
Right. I think there are a couple of different directions that might go. I think that a lot of the, well, some things I think folks can think more broadly about whether for some heat applications wood will work. For Middlebury College, for example, could be burning a fossil fuel, but they're burning wood and doing CHP, and that'll work. But bio options, bio blended into oil blends that they're using otherwise, biomethane blended into natural gas. And then I think I'm not as much expert on this, but I think that for some particular high heat type applications, there are actually new electric technologies that are in development for a lot of heat very precisely in a very particular spot, which is a different kind of industrial application. And most of the industrial energy use in the state is boilers, right? It's making a bunch of some fluid really hot, and there's got to be more options for that. I don't think you're not going to use heat pumps to get something that hot, But there's nothing that says you could or shouldn't be burning something a little bit more renewable, at least while you're doing that.
Yeah.
Is there any practical discussion right now about storage at the utility scale?
We are looking at, as I mentioned, the issues in northern Vermont, and we're looking at storage is being deployed on the utility scale around the country on sort of experimental basis at this point. We are looking at the feasibility of that, and particularly for northern Vermont, to see if there's a utility-size storage option that would work. So yeah, it's a very real. It's getting better and better, and you know, whether we do it or whether a third party does it or one of the distribution utilities like our Green Mountain Power, it's definitely an option.
Cool.
This is also for Tom. I'm curious about the interrelationship between the net metering political discussions and your work. How flexible and responsive do you feel you will be to changes in those policies?
Well, we are a little bit removed from the net metering in that the system that we operate is not, you know, the limitations on our system are not affected, quite frankly, by net metering. For us, that shows up as negative demand. And I think the technical issues reside more so on the distribution systems, the stuff on the street, going to the local substation. You know, I think the only place that we see something that affects our system would be northern Vermont. And I generally would tell you that the best thing that we can do to start off is save electricity and use less of it. And it's kind of weird in northern Vermont, because in northern Vermont, actually, if we had more electric demand in northern Vermont, that would mean we'd have to try to get less of it out. And so in northern Vermont, the more net metering you have, effectively that lowers the amount of electric demand. It exacerbates the issue a little bit. But I think the scale of net metering is not that significant. I think it's more significant relating, our system is more affected by large-scale solar or large, you know, other large generators showing up in that area.
David?
In the beginning, Jim talked about what he's doing in his region using data from the Comprehensive Energy Plan. Now that goal of getting to 90% is great. Now you're starting to plan and make assumptions of where your electricity and your energy is coming from. I see a major problem, and Jim brought it up, that we're assuming half of our electricity is going to come from imported hydro. That is a horrible assumption. If you take that half away, you now have to double in-state generation from renewables. And also the numbers used for how much solar we need in the state that Jim's basing his numbers on to find what every town has, I believe is 1/4 of the solar you need. And your wind estimates are off by the same amount. So take those two numbers and times them by 4. You have a whole different graph and a whole different discussion here of what we have to do.
And before any of you respond, I'll just offer some perspective to that. I think David's point is well taken in that whatever scenarios we are putting up, it's scenarios. There are going to be different ways to get there. And what we're doing is trying to imagine mixes of sources and technology pathways and generating sources. That will all be a moving target as we go forward, and it could be anywhere between the spectrum of what we've presented here and what David is talking about, or something that we're not talking about in the room today. So I don't want to punt the question, but I do want to make it really clear that we're not talking about a fixed target here. This is completely innovative territory, and none of us have the answer. So we would be short-sighted to rest with complacency on any particular scenario.
Just to follow up, just to make sure that we all are being realistic going forward. Otherwise, we're kidding ourselves of what we're going to try to do.
Right. Steve?
I have a question for Tom. As a regional transmission person, what's your thinking about microgrids? A good idea, bad idea, ready for prime time, always something in the future? What's your take on that?
I think, I'm sort of a all of the above kind of person. I think of, I don't say it's an experiment, I think they have some real value application-wise, particularly for emergency services, schools, hospitals. I see them playing a key role there. So my thought is, I think there's lots of technology options that are available for them. And it seems to me to be something that makes a lot of sense. I'm not sure that I see the whole grid going to a microgrid structure. But I think as I look at it, I look at critical loads, really sensitive loads, that being something really valuable.
So, short commercial announcement, a license plate GAC145, it's a Volvo, has its flashing lights on. Okay. And I'm done with that.
Probably what we planned. I'm interested in, we're dealing, except for Tom, we're sort of got a political boundary of, arbitrary, from a carbon point of view, of dealing with Vermont and how much that might hamper what the long-term goal of reducing carbon. That's sort of where we need to be. If we were, maybe that's happening as well. But, ISO in New England seems to be looking at a broader geographic area in terms of Vermont. We don't have any industry, so we're importing lots of stuff.
Yeah, the general question of sort of the overall life cycle of everything that's sort of part of our lives, right, is a whole sort of separate question. I think the way that we have tended to approach that is to say, to work within the world that we can most directly impact, which is the energy that's used here, and trust and work and support efforts to have people do good energy work in other countries or other states where that stuff is coming from, and so that its footprint falls before it gets here. Obviously, there's the whole local food movement and all those other kind of things about having more of our products be local, but still, 95% of Vermont's milk leaves the state. There's going to be interstate and international trade, but if everybody in all those different contexts, we were sitting here during the Paris climate talks, right? Everybody is doing things everywhere, then all of that gets better sort of across the board. And part of the way you make that happen and develop the momentum for that is by showing that you are in fact taking action directly locally.
Do we have time for one? Two more, okay. How about right in the middle? Yeah.
I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about Vermont's role in ISO New England's tariff agreements.
Vermont's role?
Yeah.
Anything
Yes,
is
With like the gas tariff and the discussions there.
You mean about having electric customers pay for gas, natural gas? I think it's a terrible idea. And I don't know that the Federal Power Act would allow gas infrastructure to be paid for by electric transmission customers. FERC has been clear that they don't think that's a very good idea. I don't think it's going to happen. I think quite frankly, gas pipelines are going to get built to serve, and Southern New England's going to serve heating customers. The gas companies have been signing them up, left and right down in Connecticut and Massachusetts. They buy firm capacity on gas pipelines. I think that will trigger. That will be how I view gas pipeline gets built. As it relates to, I think the concern that ISO New England has raised is that the region is about 50% gas, that we haven't built enough gas. Their assertion is there isn't enough gas pipeline to reliably serve electricity customers to power all the power plants. And there is an issue with that, but I think that ISO New England, there are other ways to get at that rather than having to pay for more pipeline. And it's a fairly long answer, but the power plant generators typically are not buying firm transportation on gas pipelines, and as a result, what happens on a really cold day, the heating load uses much of the gas capacity, and these gas power plants that provide most of the electricity aren't able to run. So ISO New England has done a number of things, including encouraging these gas power plants to have a dual fuel capability to run on oil. They have some programs to deal with that in the wintertime. I think they're using LNG in a way in New England last winter and they'll use it again. I think that's a good solution. And finally, I think there's going to be a market in 2018 where it's called pay for performance. And essentially it is, if you're a gas power plant and you're being paid to produce electricity, you need to make sure you can produce that electricity on peak. And if they don't, there'll be substantial penalties if they fail to do that. So to me, those are the best ways to look at that. I don't know if I've answered the person's question in the back about the tariff.
That's, yeah,
I'm
I think
sorry.
we'll have to stop there. It's a great question, and it's really rich. And I know there are other questions. I would encourage you to find our panelists and ask away and have a good conversation. It's 11, the next session is at 11:15, and I'm going to give people a chance to get to where they're going. So